Somewhere in the hill country of what is now southeastern Turkey, approximately 10,000 years ago, a person pressed a seed into the ground. This is not a metaphor. It was a physical act, fingers pushing into turned earth. A seed, probably einkorn wheat, the wild ancestor of almost every loaf of bread baked on earth today, being placed deliberately in a hole made deliberately in soil that had been deliberately cleared. The person doing this did not know they were making history. They did not know they were beginning the most consequential transformation in human existence. They were solving a specific, immediate problem with the specific, practical intelligence that humans have always applied to specific, practical problems. The problem was simple. There was not always enough to eat. And the solution, grow it yourself in a place you choose, at a scale you control, would change not just what human beings ate, but where they lived, how they organized their societies, what they built, what they thought about, what gods they worshipped, and how many of them there were. Almost everything about the world you live in today can be traced, if you follow the chain far enough back, to that gesture. Fingers, seed, earth. Tonight, we follow that chain.
Look at it from above. The Fertile Crescent in the 10th millennium before the Common Era, before the cities, before the writing, before the wheel, the plow, the bronze sword, the fired brick, the cuneiform tablet, the ziggurat, and everything else that we associate with the beginning of civilization. Before any of that, there was this. Two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, rising in the mountains of eastern Anatolia and flowing southward through the Syrian steppe and the Mesopotamian plain toward the Persian Gulf. Between them and around them, the arc of fertile land that gave this region its name, land that received enough rain and enough sun and had enough depth of soil to support dense stands of wild grasses whose seeds were nutritious enough to sustain human populations. At dawn, the rivers are silver. The morning mist lies in the valleys between the ridges, settling overnight from the cold air above into the warm river air below. And in that mist, the landscape appears and disappears in layers. The wild grasses on the hillsides are dense and unmanaged. The forests on the higher slopes are ancient. Nothing is organized for human purposes yet. The land is still entirely itself. The people who lived in this landscape in 12,000 BC were hunter-gatherers. We know a surprising amount about them from the material traces they left, the bones of animals they hunted, the seeds of plants they collected, the flint tools they made and discarded, the sites where they camped and the structures they sometimes built. They were not wanderers in the sense of moving without direction. They moved with the seasons, following the resources that the land provided at different times of year. They knew the landscape they moved through with an intimacy that is difficult for settled people to fully imagine. Watch them in the woodland. A small group of 8 people moving through open oak woodland in the Levantine region. The adults are dressed in sewn animal skin, practical and warm. One man carries a spear with a carefully napped flint point. The women move through the undergrowth gathering berries and roots with a practiced efficiency that is invisible to an outsider but obvious to anyone who knows what they are doing. 2 children follow closely, learning the landscape the way all children learn, by watching adults navigate it. They are not struggling. This is a common misconception about pre-agricultural life, that hunter-gatherers were always on the edge of starvation, barely surviving in a hostile world. The archaeological evidence does not support this. Hunter-gatherer skeletons from this period are generally healthier than early farming skeletons. They are taller. Their bones show less evidence of nutritional deficiency. Their teeth are better. They worked fewer hours per day than early farmers. What they could not do was maintain large, dense, permanent populations. A landscape can support far more people if you are growing food on it than if you are gathering food from it. The wild productivity of the Fertile Crescent was extraordinary by the standards of most environments, but it had a ceiling. At some point, the landscape was producing as much food as it naturally could, and the human population that depended on it was pressing against that ceiling. At night, the campfire was the center of everything. A temporary camp in the Jordan Valley, simple lean-to shelters between rocky outcroppings, a central fire burning with 3 people visible around it preparing food, animal bones and flint-knapping debris scattered around the fire, the debris of daily life in a portable world, a child asleep near the warmth. This campfire, and tens of thousands like it across the landscape of human prehistory, was the center of social life for 200,000 years. Cooking, warmth, protection from predators at night, the conversations that built human language and human culture, the sharing of food that made human cooperation possible on a scale that no other social animal achieved. But the campfire moved. It had to move. The food that sustained it was where the food was, not where the people preferred to be. And then, around 11,000 years ago, something began to change. A woman on a hillside in the Levant, in the late afternoon light of an early autumn day, cutting wild einkorn wheat with a flint-bladed sickle. She is what archaeologists call a Natufian, a member of the culture that occupies the Levant in the period just before agriculture begins, a culture that is already semi-settled in the sense that it has begun building more permanent structures and storing food between seasons. Her basket is already partly full of grain heads. Around her, the hillside is covered in wild wheat in its characteristic dense stands. She has done this before. Her mother did this before her grandmother before that. The collection of wild grain from the natural stands that grew on the hillsides of the Levant was already an organized seasonal activity for thousands of years before anyone thought to plant grain deliberately. That is the context in which the agricultural revolution happened. Not a sudden invention, but a slow drift along a continuum that already existed. The Natufian woman collecting wild grain was already most of the way along that continuum. The next step, saving some grain heads to plant near the settlement instead of only collecting from wherever the grain happened to grow, was a small step from where she already was. Small in practice, enormous in consequence. The semi-permanent Natufian settlement of Ain Ghazal on its hillside above a spring communicates this transition visually. These are not the temporary camps of pure nomads. The circular stone-walled structures with their brush roofs are more substantial than lean-tos. There is investment in place here. People have decided that this specific location is worth building something at, something that they intend to come back to. The settlement is the seed of the village, not yet the village itself, but heading in that direction, following a logic that seems, in retrospect, almost inevitable.
The moment of planting is not dramatic. It cannot be. The most consequential single act in human history looks from the outside like a person kneeling in a field and pressing small objects into the ground. The significance is entirely in the invisible future. The seed does not know what it is beginning. The person planting it does not know either, not in any complete sense. Look at the hands. In the northern Fertile Crescent, in approximately 9500 BC, a pair of human hands pressing einkorn wheat seeds one by one into holes made with a pointed digging stick. The hands are weathered. The knuckles are large. The dark soil, freshly turned, still moist from recent rain, surrounds each seed as it goes in. A few small green seedlings from a previous sowing are visible at the edge of the turned soil. The experiment, if that is the right word, has already started. This is a return visit. The significance of deliberate planting is not that it suddenly provided more food. In the short term, gathering wild grain from natural stands was probably more productive per hour of effort than cultivating a small plot of ground. The significance is control. The gardener or farmer can choose where the food grows. They can choose when to plant, how densely to plant, how much water to provide. They can protect the growing crop from animals. They can harvest it at the optimal time. They can save the seeds from the best plants to plant next year. Each of these freedoms represents a feedback loop that over generations will transform both the plant and the society growing it. The first cultivated grain field in the Karakadağ mountain region of modern Turkey in approximately 9000 BC is a small rectangle of cleared hillside. Not impressive from a distance. The wild vegetation has been removed from a terrace on the hill slope by hand labor with stone tools. The cultivated wheat plants are growing in a pattern that no wild plant ever grows in, organized, evenly spaced, the same species. This uniformity is itself evidence of human intention. Wild plants are diverse and irregular. These are not. Morning light catches the difference. The cultivated field on the terrace above the settlement, the farmer's simple structures at the field edge. The world's first farm is completely ordinary looking. The flint sickle being assembled in a craftsman's hands is the tool that makes this possible at useful scale. Wild grain and early cultivated grain, which is not yet very different from wild grain, has the frustrating characteristic of its seeds falling from the plant when they ripen. This is the plant's seed dispersal strategy, and it is perfectly adaptive for a wild plant. For a human trying to harvest the grain, it is a problem. The sickle allows the harvester to cut the entire stalk before the seeds fall, carrying the intact grain head to a processing area where the seeds can be separated under controlled conditions. The flint blades inserted into the wooden handle of this sickle have a distinctive luster on their cutting edge, a silica polish that develops only when flint has been used to cut grass. Archaeologists can identify ancient sickle blades by this specific polish. The polish tells us that thousands of years before the first deliberate planting, human beings were already harvesting grass seeds at scale. They were already thinking about grain differently from other gathered foods. The first cultivated grain field in the world was probably planted by someone who was already the daughter of grain harvesters and the granddaughter of grain harvesters, and who understood the behavior of the plant in a level of detail that we are only now beginning to recover through the combination of genetics and archaeology. She knew what she was doing. She just did not know the scale of what she was starting. By 8500 BC, some of the people of the Fertile Crescent were building things that were clearly not temporary. The pre-pottery Neolithic village of Ain Ghazal in Jordan is a settlement of rectangular mud brick and stone structures arranged around open communal spaces. 40 or so buildings, a communal grain storage structure at the settlement center. People moving between the buildings in the morning activity of a community that has decided to stay. The decision to stay is the agricultural revolution in its social form. You do not invest in permanent buildings if you intend to move seasonally. You invest in permanent buildings when the food supply is reliable enough and concentrated enough near one location that staying is better than moving. The field chains you to a place, and the place becomes home. Inside the first permanent houses, the material world of the transition is visible in its daily particulars. A lime-plastered floor, a central hearth with ash and coals, grain stored in large baskets against one wall, a stone quern grinding stone, animal skins for sleeping.
This is what civilization begins as. Not palaces, not temples, not armies. A room with a hearth, a floor someone thought to plaster smooth, a basket of grain. The grain is the whole story. The room exists because of the grain. The settlement exists because of the grain. The social structures and the political structures and the religious traditions and the astronomical observations and the writing systems and the cities and the empires that follow will all exist because of the grain. But it begins here, in a plastered room with a stone quern and a basket on the wall.
6 people in a field. This is what the agricultural revolution looks like at ground level. Not a discovery, not an invention. A field and the people working it, and the grain that connects them to a place and to each other and to the seasons in a way that changes everything about how they organize their time and their relationships. The harvest is collective not by accident, but by necessity. The grain ripens all at once on a window of a few days before the seeds begin to fall. You need to cut the field faster than the seeds will fall. One person cannot do this. 6 people can. The organized division of labor that the harvest requires, cutters, gatherers, carriers, is not just an agricultural technique, it is a social technique. The first step toward the complex division of labor that will eventually produce cities. You cannot have a city without people who grow food and people who do not grow food but are fed by those who do. You cannot get there in one step, but the first step is a harvest, and a harvest requires the specific kind of organized cooperation that you can see in 6 people working a field together. The grain comes off the stalks in bundles. The bundles go to a central pile at the field edge. Later, they will be carried to the threshing floor. The threshing floor is a flat stone or a flat cleared area of hard-packed earth where the bundles of grain are beaten against a surface to release the grain heads from the stalks. The grain heads and chaff fall together and then must be separated. Tossing the mixture in a flat woven basket, winnowing lets the lighter chaff blow away in the wind while the heavier grain falls back into the basket. Then the grain is collected and carried to the storage area. It is relentless, repetitive, physical work. And it requires processing. The grain cannot be eaten as it comes from the plant. It must be ground into flour, mixed with water and cooked. The saddle quern, a flat lower stone with a slightly concave surface and an upper stone that is pushed back and forth over the grain, produces a coarse flour. The movement is forward and back, leaning into the work, the upper stone riding over the grain and cracking it between the 2 stone surfaces. Skeletal analysis of early Neolithic women shows characteristic changes in the bones of the knees, the feet, and the spine that result from thousands of hours on the knees in the saddle quern posture. The work of grinding grain is written permanently into the skeletons of the people who did it. Their bodies were changed by the agricultural revolution as much as their settlements were. From the flour comes the bread. The very first bread was probably not leavened, no yeast, no rising, a flat piece of dough cooked on a hot stone near a fire. The result was dense and nutritious and not particularly appetizing by modern standards, but it was transportable, it was storable to some degree, and it was the product of grain that had been harvested, threshed, winnowed, and ground, a chain of processing that converted a raw grain seed into a food that could sustain human beings through seasons when nothing else was growing. Bread is civilized food, not in the sense of being refined or delicate, in the exact sense of belonging to a civilization
rather than a hunter-gatherer band. Hunter-gatherers ate varied diets from many sources. A farming community in the early Neolithic was eating an increasingly grain-dominated diet that provided calories reliably but was nutritionally narrower than what their ancestors had eaten. The trade-off, more calories reliably, fewer nutrients diversely, is visible in the archaeological record. Early farming communities show more evidence of nutritional deficiency diseases than hunter-gatherer communities. They also show population growth. More people can be fed, even if those people are on average slightly less well-nourished. The agricultural revolution traded quality of diet for quantity of food supply, and quantity of food supply for population size. The populations grew, and growing populations need more food, and more food means more farming. The logic is self-reinforcing in a way that once started does not easily stop. The goats were the next piece. On a mountain slope in the Zagros in approximately 9000 BC, a young man approaching a small group of wild bezoar goats with a handful of grain. These are the ancestors of all domestic goats. They are not yet domestic, but they are responding to the human presence in the way that animals with a certain cognitive profile respond to reliable food provision. One is already taking grain from an open hand. This is how domestication begins, not through force, through a long, slow, probabilistic process by which the animals that are least frightened of human beings and that are most willing to accept supplemental food from human hands are the animals that survive to reproduce in proximity to human settlements. Generation by generation, the animals that live near the settlement are slightly less wild than their parents. The humans are not consciously selecting for tameness, but they are, by feeding and protecting and tolerating the less frightened individuals, doing exactly that. 100 generations of goats later, the animals are something different, not yet fully domestic, but on the way.
The relationship between human beings and the animals they domesticated is one of the most consequential and most complicated relationships in the history of life on Earth. Complicated because it did not happen all at once. Complicated because different species were domesticated at different times, in different places, for different reasons, through different processes. Complicated because the animals did not choose to be domesticated in any meaningful sense, and yet the domesticated form of each species has, in most cases, achieved vastly greater numbers than the wild form. By 7500 BC, in settlements across the Near East, small flocks of domesticated goats are living in stone-walled enclosures adjacent to human settlements. They are fed food scraps and crop residue. They are protected at night from predators. They are not taken out to forage for themselves. They are managed. A child sitting on the pen wall watching the sheep below has grown up knowing these animals as part of the household, not wild things to be hunted, not entirely separate from human life, managed creatures whose presence is a regular part of daily experience. The benefits flow in multiple directions. The animals provide milk, which is a renewable food source that does not require killing the animal. They provide wool, which requires breeding toward that characteristic. The wild ancestor of domestic sheep does not have a fleece that is useful to humans, only a natural coat that sheds in spring. They provide dung, which the early farmers are beginning to understand can be applied to the fields to improve crop growth. And they provide meat when an animal reaches the end of its productive life. The aurochs, the wild ancestor of all domestic cattle, was the largest and most dangerous wild bovine in the world, larger than a modern bison, with long curved horns and the temperament of an animal that was prey to lions and wolves and had survived by being large and aggressive. Domesticating the aurochs required subduing something that could kill a person without effort. It was done by approximately 8000 BC in the northern Fertile Crescent.
not all at once, not by a single act of conquest, through the same long, gradual process of selecting for the animals that were less aggressive towards humans, feeding them and protecting them until the less aggressive individuals had more offspring than the aggressive ones, and over generations, producing an animal that, while still massive, would accept the constraint of a halter and allow itself to be led. The moment of a large domesticated aurochs being led by a rope halter by two Neolithic men communicates something important. The animal is still enormous. The men are clearly managing it carefully, not casually. The rope is just taut enough to show the animal's semi-compliance. This is not the placid domestic cow of a few thousand years later. It is the early stage of the relationship, still tentative on both sides. But the relationship is established, and its potential is already enormous. An aurochs can pull a load, it can pull a plow, it can carry goods. The strength of the largest land animal in the Neolithic world, redirected through the human-animal compact of domestication, is the engine on which early civilization will run. The first milking of a domesticated goat in approximately 7,500 BC is a moment of quiet revolution. Milk is a renewable food source. You do not need to kill the animal to obtain it. You need to maintain the relationship. The animal needs to trust the person milking it, needs to accept the constraint, needs not to kick or escape. The relationship that makes milking possible requires daily management, daily presence, daily interaction. The dairy farmer and the dairy animal are bound to each other by routine. That binding is another form of the same process that the grain field created. You cannot leave for the season and come back to your dairy animals. They need daily care. They chain you to a place, just as the grain does, just as the irrigation channel does. The irrigation channel. The first channel dug from a spring to a cultivated field. 4 Neolithic farmers using stone-tipped digging sticks and wooden scoops. The channel already dug for several meters, water beginning to flow along its bottom. The dry earth waiting at the channel end, about to receive the water that will make farming possible where it was not possible before. The irrigation channel is one of the most important objects in human history, not because of what it is, a simple trench in the earth, but because of what it represents. The deliberate manipulation of natural water flow for human agricultural purposes, the beginning of the hydraulic management of the landscape that will eventually produce the Mesopotamian irrigation canals, the Egyptian shaduf, the Purian qanat, the Han Dynasty water control systems, the Roman aqueducts, and the dam systems of the modern world. All of it begins with a trench in the Jordan Valley dug by 4 people with sticks. The moment when the first irrigation water reaches the dry field at its end is one of the most dramatic small events in prehistory. The water visible flowing along the new channel and spreading across the dry brown soil at the field edge. The brown earth darkening to rich dark loam as the water saturates it, the farmer watching from the channel control point. Water on dry land. The transformation is immediate and visible. The brown becomes dark, the dry becomes wet. The promise of growth arrives in a visible color change. This moment has been repeated on an ever larger scale for 10,000 years. Every irrigation project in human history is the same moment, the arrival of water where there was no water, the darkening of dry earth, the farmer watching. It never stopped being remarkable.
The mud brick house changed what it meant to be human. Not immediately, not by itself, but the act of building a permanent structure, investing labor in a dwelling that you intend to return to season after season, year after year, commits a human being to a place in a way that no temporary shelter does. The permanent house is the physical expression of the decision to stay. In approximately 8,000 BC, at Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, workers are mixing clay with straw and water in a shallow pit, the oldest recipe for building material in the world. The straw provides tensile strength to the dried clay. Without it, the brick cracks as it dries. With it, the brick holds its form well enough to be stacked into walls, and the walls hold themselves up for years, and the years become decades, and the settlement built from these walls becomes the world's first large community of sedentary farming people. The mud brick that comes out of the mold is a simple object, a rectangle of gray-brown clay and straw mixture dried in the sun for a few days until it is hard enough to handle. When stacked with mud mortar between the courses, the wall that results is thick enough to provide insulation against the summer heat and the winter cold. Inside, the plastered walls can be decorated, and at Çatalhöyük, they were. The interior of a Çatalhöyük house in approximately 7,500 BC in central Anatolia is not what most people would expect from the Neolithic period. The walls are covered in white lime plaster, applied in multiple layers over the life of the building. On the plaster, red ochre handprints and geometric patterns painted in strips near the ceiling. Animal skulls and horns mounted in the wall plaster as decoration. This was not a bare survival shelter. It was a home. The people who lived here had opinions about how their living space should look. They made aesthetic decisions. They maintained their walls. They chose to apply decoration. The interiority of domestic life, the sense that the home is a place with its own character, its own visual language, its own meaning, was already present in 7,500 BC in central Anatolia. The Çatalhöyük settlement, at its height in approximately 7,000 BC, was home to perhaps 6,000 to 8,000 people. Not a city in any later sense, but not a village either. Something in between that had not existed before. What made Çatalhöyük remarkable, and what still makes it remarkable to archaeologists who study it, was its organization, or rather, its lack of the organization we would expect. The buildings were built directly against each other, sharing walls, with no streets between them. Access to the buildings was through holes in the roofs. The residents walked on the rooftops and descended into their homes through roof-level openings. The settlement was organized horizontally rather than vertically, extending across the tell like a honeycomb rather than stacking upward. This is a planning philosophy unlike anything that came before or after. The Neolithic mind that designed Çatalhöyük was solving the problem of community life in a way that no subsequent town planner has replicated. The transition to textile production was happening at the same time in settlements across the Fertile Crescent and Anatolia. Linen from cultivated flax, wool from domesticated sheep, and the loom to weave them. The warp-weighted loom, two upright wooden poles with a horizontal crossbar, vertical threads hanging from the crossbar with stone weights at their lower ends, is an elegant, simple machine ever devised. The warp threads hang under tension from the weights. The weft thread is passed horizontally through alternate warp threads, and when the alternate shed is selected, the weft is locked in place. The cloth builds up from the top down as the weaving progresses. The cloth this produces is simple, a plain weave linen or wool textile, undyed or dyed with plant colors, but cloth. Fabric that drapes and folds and can be cut and sewn into clothing more comfortable and more adaptable than animal skins. The weaver working at the loom, passing the weft thread through with her fingers, is performing the same fundamental motion that textile workers will perform for the next 10,000 years. The technology will change, the loom will become more sophisticated, the thread finer, the patterns more complex, but the basic operation of passing a horizontal thread through vertical threads remains. Pottery arrived at roughly the same time. Not in a single invention, in multiple independent inventions, in different places, at different times, all converging on the same solution to the same problem. The problem was containers. Specifically, containers that could hold liquids, resist fire, and be produced from locally available materials.
Clay is available almost everywhere. When dried, it holds its shape. When fired, it becomes permanent and largely waterproof. The earliest pottery was made by coiling, building up the walls of a vessel from ropes of clay wound in spiraling layers, then smoothing the interior and exterior surfaces. The coiled pot required no wheel, it required only hands and skill, and the knowledge of how to manage the drying and firing process. A Neolithic woman's hands building a clay vessel in approximately 7000 BC, the coils being smoothed with a wet stone tool, the walls of the vessel taking shape under her fingers. She is inventing nothing in the sense of a sudden inspiration. She is solving a practical problem with the materials available to her in a way that many women in many places were solving the same problem at roughly the same time. The pottery once fired is the durable record of agricultural life. It holds grain, it holds water, it holds the fermented products, beer, wine, yogurt, that agricultural surplus makes possible. It is carried along trade routes and becomes one of the primary ways that archaeologists trace the spread of agricultural traditions across the landscape of the ancient world.
The firing of the first clay vessels was probably an accident, or at least an observation. Clay figurines left near hearth fires or clay-lined pits used for cooking vessels would have shown the potter what heat did to clay, hardened it, changed it from something that would return to mud when wet to something permanent and resistant. The transition from observing this to producing it deliberately, to building small kilns and managing the temperature and duration of the firing process, is a transition that archaeology can trace in the improvement of pottery quality over centuries. The earliest fired pottery is regular, unevenly fired, often fragmentary. The pottery of a few hundred years later is more consistent, harder, less porous. A small group of clay vessels being fired in a simple pit kiln in approximately 7000 BC in the Near East. The vessels arranged in the pit surrounded by hot coals and covered with more coals and ash. The orange glow of the fired coals visible around the vessels. A Neolithic potter tending the fire. The potter's judgment matters enormously. Too low a temperature and the clay doesn't fully fire. Too high and the vessels crack. The color of the smoke, the temperature of the coals, the visible behavior of the clay through the firing, these are the signals that an experienced potter reads and responds to. The knowledge is embodied, not written. It lives in the hands and the eyes and the accumulated experience of people who have done this many times and learned from the failures as much as the successes. This embodied knowledge, practical intelligence that lives in skilled practitioners rather than in texts, is one of the least visible but most important forms of knowledge in the agricultural world. The potter knows how to fire clay. The farmer knows which plants to select for seed. The herder knows which animals to keep for breeding. The weaver knows how to maintain an even tension in the warp. None of this knowledge was written down for thousands of years after it was first developed. It was transmitted from practitioner to practitioner, parent to child, master to apprentice, through demonstration and practice and correction. The loss of any one of these chains of transmission, through death, through migration, through the disruption of a community, was the permanent loss of knowledge that might take generations to reconstruct. Grain storage was the agricultural technology that made population density possible. A large, round mud brick storage structure with a domed roof and sealed entrance at a Neolithic village in the Fertile Crescent in approximately 8000 BC. Inside, large ceramic storage vessels being filled from woven baskets of harvested grain. The grain going into the vessels in a steady pour. Other sealed vessels already in position around the storage room walls. The ability to store grain, to accumulate a surplus of food that can be drawn down during the hungry months before the next harvest, is the technology that breaks the seasonal dependence on immediate food availability. A hunter-gatherer band must eat what is available now.
A farming community with adequate grain storage can eat what was produced months ago. This ability to decouple production from consumption in time is one of the most consequential changes the agricultural revolution produced. It makes possible the accumulation of surplus. And surplus makes possible everything that surplus has always made possible. The support of people who do not grow food but provide other services. The investment in non-productive activities like monument building and ritual. The development of social hierarchies that manage and control the surplus, and eventually the cities and states that are built on the agricultural foundation. But before any of that, the surplus has to be produced. And the production of a surplus requires a kind of understanding of the crop and the land that only develops through careful observation over many seasons. The intelligence of seed selection. A Neolithic farmer sorting through a pile of harvested grain on a flat stone in approximately 8,500 BC in the Fertile Crescent. His hands visible setting aside the largest and most fully developed grains in a separate pile. His face in profile showing the concentrated attention of someone making selections that will shape the next generation of the crop. The logic of seed selection is simple. If you consistently save the seeds from the largest, most productive plants and plant those seeds next year, the next year's crop will tend to be slightly more like the plants you selected from than like the average of the whole population. Over generations, this consistent selection in the direction of larger seeds, stronger stalks, more seed heads per plant, produces a domesticated grain that is measurably different from the wild ancestor. The transition from wild einkorn to domesticated einkorn is visible in the archaeological record as a change in seed size and stalk strength that takes roughly 1,000 years of human cultivation. No single person planned this transformation. It is the cumulative result of thousands of individual seed selection decisions made by thousands of farmers over dozens of generations. Collective intelligence operating across time, without any single understanding the direction it was moving. The pigs came to the settlement on their own terms. Wild boar near a human settlement are attracted to the food scraps and grain waste that settlements inevitably produce. A Neolithic settlement is a food source for omnivores. The boar that are bold enough to come close enough to benefit from this food source and that are not aggressive enough to be driven away or hunted begin an association with the settlement that will, over generations, produce the domestic pig. A woman throwing food scraps over a fence wall to a group of wild boar in a fenced enclosure. The boar eating the scraps with the comfortable indifference of animals that have been receiving supplemental food long enough to have stopped being frightened of humans. The enclosure itself communicates that the management has already begun. Someone decided to build a fence. The semi-wild boar are already, in some sense, managed. And on a morning in the Neolithic Fertile Crescent, in the organized activity of a functioning agricultural village, all of these elements come together. The cooking fires with their smoke, the people moving purposefully between the grain fields and the storage buildings and the animal enclosures, the children near the pens, the women grinding grain in the doorways, the men heading to the fields with their tools. This is the new world. The world that the agricultural revolution made. A world organized not around following the food, but growing it, storing it, managing it, and sharing it among people who have committed to a place. It is a world that will not stop growing.
The agricultural revolution did not happen once and spread everywhere. It happened independently in at least 7 different places across the world, as different human populations arrived at the same solution through different paths with different plants and different animals. The Fertile Crescent was the first, but it was not alone. Each of the world's great river systems produced its own agricultural tradition in its own time, from its own set of wild plant and animal species that happened to be domesticable in that landscape. The Nile Valley in approximately 6000 BC
when agriculture first arrived from the Fertile Crescent, is the most visually dramatic example of the agricultural transformation of a landscape. The Nile is a green ribbon in a pale desert. That is all it is and all it has ever been. The agricultural land of Egypt is the floodplain, the strip of rich, dark silt deposited each year by the Nile's annual inundation, and nothing else. Beyond the floodplain, the desert begins immediately. The line is precise: green on one side, pale yellow on the other. Within the green, the rectangular cultivated fields are beginning to appear from the aerial view as a pattern of organized human intention imposed on the natural vegetation of the floodplain. Early Nile Valley farming in approximately 5500 BC looks like Fertile Crescent farming adapted to the specific gifts and specific constraints of the Egyptian landscape. The soil is the Nile's gift, the richest alluvial soil in the ancient world, replenished each year by the flood. The irrigation is the Nile's gift as well, the floodwaters rising and spreading across the plain and retreating, leaving the wet, dark, ready soil. The Egyptian farmer's first task is not irrigation, but timing, planting in the exact window between the retreat of the flood and the drying of the soil. The wooden-tipped plow pulled by domesticated cattle appears in Egypt relatively quickly after the introduction of farming because the Nile silt, unlike the harder soils of Anatolia, is already soft enough from the flood moisture to be broken with lighter tools. Further east, across the Indus Plain in what is now Pakistan, the earliest farming settlements appear at Mehrgar in approximately 7000 BC, not much later than the Fertile Crescent settlements, and arguably independent in origin. The Indus Plain stretching to the horizon, the Bolan Pass into Baluchistan visible in the distance, the first small farming settlement as a cluster of mud brick structures on the plain edge. This is the landscape that will produce Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, two of the most sophisticated cities of the ancient world. But 3,000 years before those cities exist, Mehrgar is farming. The Yellow River in Hainan Province in approximately 7000 BC, the Loess Plateau, the specific yellow soil. Early Chinese Neolithic farmers on a hillside, clearing vegetation with stone tools, preparing the land for the first millet planting. The agricultural tradition that will produce Chinese civilization is beginning here in the river valley that will remain China's agricultural heartland for the next 9,000 years. Not all Chinese agriculture is the same as Fertile Crescent agriculture. The Yellow River Valley produces millet, foxtail millet, and broomcorn millet, not wheat and barley. The cultivation methods are similar, but the specific crops and their specific cultivation requirements are different. And farther south, in the Yangtze River Valley in approximately 7000 BC, a completely different agricultural tradition is beginning: rice. The wet paddy of the Yangtze River Valley in approximately 7000 BC, the flooded fields reflecting the gray morning sky, Hemudu culture farmers transplanting rice seedlings in the shallow paddy water, standing ankle-deep in the flooded field and pressing individual seedlings into the mud. Wet rice cultivation is perhaps the most labor-intensive form of agriculture ever developed. The paddy fields must be flooded, leveled, maintained. The seedlings must be transplanted from nursery beds to the main field. The water level must be managed through the growing season. The harvest requires skilled timing. The yield per unit of land, however, is extraordinary, higher than any other cereal crop if the conditions are right. And the labor of maintaining the conditions produces, over generations, communities organized around the collective management of water in a way that creates specific social forms. The agricultural traditions of Asia and the Middle East and Africa were not the only ones. In the highlands of New Guinea in approximately 7000 BC, an independent agricultural tradition was developing around taro and banana. Farmers on cleared garden plots in the tropical forest, digging mounds of earth for taro planting with wooden digging sticks. New Guinea agriculture is one of the least discussed of the world's independent agricultural origins, perhaps because it did not produce the cities and empires that Fertile Crescent or Chinese agriculture produced.
but it was genuinely independent. The people of New Guinea arrived at agriculture on their own, with their own plants, through their own process, and they maintained agricultural communities in the New Guinea highlands for at least 9,000 years, which is roughly as long as agriculture has existed anywhere.
The Americas were not waiting for agriculture to arrive from the Old World. They were developing it themselves, from completely different plants, through completely different processes, at roughly the same time. In the Balsas River Valley of what is now the Mexican state of Guerrero in approximately 8700 BC, a Mesoamerican farmer is tending a small garden plot where wild teosinte grass is being selectively cultivated for its larger seed heads. The teosinte plant is the wild ancestor of maize. Looking at a teosinte plant and a modern maize plant side by side, it is almost impossible to believe they are the same species. The teosinte has thin branching stalks with multiple small ears of only a few dozen seeds each. The maize has a single thick stalk with a large cob of hundreds of seeds. The transformation of teosinte into maize required approximately 10,000 years of human selection. It is the most dramatic example of plant domestication in human history. What began as a wild grass with small, hard seeds enclosed in a stony husk became, through the accumulated seed selection decisions of 10,000 years of farmers, the most productive cereal crop on Earth. The farmer tending the teosinte in 8700 BC cannot see where this is going. He can see that some plants have slightly larger seed heads than others. He can see that those plants are worth saving seed from. That is all he sees. The maize is 10,000 years in the future. In the Andean highlands, in approximately 7000 BC, a completely different agricultural origin was underway. The wild potato grows in the Andes at elevations between 2,000 and 4,000 meters, producing small, bitter tubers that are toxic to humans in their wild form. The indigenous people of the Andes developed a process called freeze-drying, using the extreme cold of Andean nights and the sun of Andean days to freeze and thaw and press and dry the potatoes into a storable, non-toxic product called chuño that transformed a toxic wild plant into one of the most nutritious and storable foods in the world. An Andean farmer digging up a cluster of small wild potato tubers with a wooden digging stick and examining them, selecting the best ones to replant. The beginning of 10,000 years of breeding that will produce the potato in the form that will eventually feed half of Europe and become one of the most important crops in the world. The African agricultural tradition was developing independently in the Sahel region of sub-Saharan Africa. In approximately 4000 BC, farmers in the savanna south of what is becoming the Sahara Desert are cultivating sorghum, a tall grass with large seed heads particularly adapted to hot, dry conditions. African sorghum farming developed in the specific ecological zone between the desert and the rainforest, in the band of dry savanna grassland that receives summer rainfall but not enough to support wet rice farming. And in the Sahara itself, in approximately 7000 BC, at a time when the Sahara was green, when the monsoons reached farther north than they do today, and the landscape that is now the world's largest desert was a savanna dotted with lakes, cattle herding was developing as one of the earliest forms of animal husbandry in Africa. Saharan cattle herders with their long-horned cattle on a green savanna grassland. The specific African domestic cattle breed with its distinctive lyre-shaped horns visible in the herd. Herders in ochre-decorated dress moving the herd toward a water source. The cattle herders of the Green Sahara left their record in the rock art of the Saharan mountains, the paintings of cattle and hippopotami and giraffes in landscapes that are now pure sand. The drying of the Sahara, which began around 5000 BC as the monsoon belt shifted south, would gradually push the cattle herders toward the Nile Valley and the Sahel, carrying their pastoral traditions into the agricultural traditions of those regions. The agricultural revolution was not a single event or a single invention. It was a global phenomenon, produced independently in different places by different people from different wild species, driven everywhere by the same fundamental logic. The ability to grow food is more controllable than the ability to find it. Different plants, different animals, different landscapes, different timescales. The same fundamental transformation of the human relationship with the natural world.
The agricultural revolution did not stop at farming. It created the conditions for the development of all the other technologies that we associate with ancient civilization. The plow is the most important of these. In approximately 4000 BC in Mesopotamia, a Neolithic farmer is guiding a simple wooden ard through a field while a domesticated ox pulls it forward. The ard, a forked wooden implement that scratches a furrow in the soil without turning it, represents a fundamental change in the scale of farming that human labor alone cannot achieve. A person with a digging stick can prepare perhaps 1/10 of an acre of soil per day. A person with an ox-drawn ard can prepare several acres. The difference in agricultural productive capacity is not incremental, it is transformational. More land can be brought under cultivation with less labor. More food can be produced with the same number of people. The surplus that this additional production creates is the economic foundation of the first cities. Cities require people who do not grow food: administrators, priests, artisans, soldiers. Those people must be fed by the agricultural surplus of the farming population. The ox-drawn plow is the technology that makes the agricultural surplus large enough to support urban populations. The first copper agricultural tool, being made in approximately 5000 BC in Anatolia, is a small step from stone tools to metal tools that will, over the following millennia, transform agricultural efficiency. A metalsmith hammering a small piece of native copper on a stone anvil with a heavier stone hammer, the copper being shaped into a small sickle blade, the hammer marks visible on the surface of the beaten popper. Native copper, copper that occurs in its metallic form in nature rather than needing to be extracted from ore, was the first metal used by human beings. It can be worked cold by hammering, unlike bronze or iron, which require smelting. The resulting tools are not dramatically superior to well-made flint tools in cutting ability, but they are more durable and do not shatter when struck against stone. The transition to bronze, an alloy of copper and tin that is harder and more durable than either metal alone, will come later, around 3000 BC. The transition to iron will come later still, but the first copper tool, hammered from native metal, is the beginning of the metalworking tradition that will eventually produce the Iron Age plow that will allow farmers to break the heavy clay soils of northern Europe. The Mesopotamian floodplain in approximately 6000 BC is being transformed by the first large-scale irrigation systems. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers, flowing across a flat alluvial plain with no natural drop in elevation that would create reliable irrigation by gravity, require engineering to make the water go where the farmers need it to go. The solution was canals. Not small channels from springs to fields, large primary canals dug from the rivers themselves, extending across the flat plain for kilometers, with secondary channels branching from the primary canal into the fields on both sides. The scale of this engineering is genuinely impressive for 6000 BC. Moving the volume of earth required to create a canal network capable of irrigating thousands of acres of cropland required organized collective labor of a kind that goes beyond the community labor of a village harvest. It required coordination across multiple villages, shared planning, and a governance structure capable of organizing and directing the work.
The irrigation canal is not just an agricultural technology, it is the infrastructure of state formation. The people who control the irrigation canal control the water. The people who control the water control the food supply. The people who control the food supply control the population. This dynamic, the political power derived from control of agricultural infrastructure, appears everywhere that large-scale irrigation agriculture develops. It appears in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in the Indus Valley, in China. It may be the single most important political technology the agricultural revolution produced. One of the world's earliest cities is beginning at Eridu in southern Mesopotamia in approximately 5400 BC. A compact settlement of mud brick structures on the flat alluvial plain, a small temple structure at the settlement center as the largest building, the surrounding agricultural fields in their irrigated green, a water channel from the Euphrates to the settlement. Eridu has a population of perhaps several thousand people. By any reasonable definition, this is a city, a settlement large enough that not everyone can know everyone else, with a division of labor complex enough to include full-time specialists, and with a government structure capable of organizing the collective activities of the community. And the administration that manages the grain surplus, the allocation and recording of agricultural production and distribution, is producing the technology that will eventually become writing. In approximately 3500 BC in early Mesopotamia, an early Mesopotamian administrator is making tally marks on a clay tablet with a pointed reed stylus. Beside the wet tablet, small clay tokens of different shapes representing quantities of grain, sheep, and other goods. The tablet shows the impressed token shapes that are the direct ancestors of cuneiform writing. The first writing was agricultural accounting, not poetry, not history, not theology, grain receipts. The agricultural surplus was so large and so complex that the human memory could no longer track it. Writing was the technological solution to the information management problem created by agricultural success.
The agricultural surplus changed what human societies were for. Hunter-gatherer societies are societies organized primarily around the acquisition of food. Almost all adult activity is directed, directly or indirectly, toward feeding the group. There is very little surplus, food above what is immediately needed, and what surplus exists cannot be stored for long. Agricultural societies produce and accumulate food surplus as a normal feature of their operation. The question then becomes, what do you do with the surplus? The answers that human societies have given to this question include build temples, organize armies, support craftspeople, pay administrators, trade for goods from distant regions, feast, and build monuments to ancestors. The specific answers vary enormously between cultures and periods, but the fact that the question can be asked at all, the fact that there is surplus to direct, is entirely the product of the agricultural revolution. The first agricultural market in a Mesopotamian settlement in approximately 5000 BC. Farmers bringing surplus grain in ceramic jars to a central exchange point, trading grain for clay vessels, flint tools, and shell ornaments from specialist craftspeople who do not farm. The craftspeople who do not farm are the most important new social category that the agricultural surplus creates. The potter who spends all day making pots cannot also spend all day farming. He is fed by the food produced by the farmers in exchange for the pots he produces. This is the division of labor in its simplest form, and it is the building block of everything else that economic specialization eventually produces. The earliest olive cultivation in approximately 4000 BC in the eastern Mediterranean is a different kind of agricultural investment. Rows of young olive trees on a hillside terrace in the Levantine landscape. Farmers tending the trees by removing competing vegetation. An older tree visible already producing its first small fruit.
An olive tree takes 5 to 7 years from planting to first significant fruit production and 20 to 30 years to reach full productivity. The decision to plant an olive orchard is a decision about the future, a commitment to a place and to a crop that will not repay the investment within any reasonable planning horizon for a mobile society. Only settled people plant olive trees. Only people who are confident they will still be in the same place in 30 years, or that their children will be there if they are not, plant olive trees. The olive orchard is the most durable commitment to agricultural settlement that the ancient Mediterranean world produced. Some of the olive trees in the Mediterranean today are genuinely old. Old enough that the trees and the land they grow on have absorbed the history of everything that has happened around them since the Roman Empire was young. The grapevine and the fermented product it produces arrived in human agriculture at roughly the same time as the olive. In the South Caucasus, in approximately 6000 BC, a Neolithic farmer is training wild grapevines onto a wooden frame between two posts. The vines with their tendrils grasping the wood. Clusters of small wild grapes visible on the trained vine. The beginning of viticulture. The wine produced from these early vineyards was probably quite different from modern wine. Wild yeast fermentation producing variable results, no knowledge of sterile technique, no control of the process beyond what observation and experience allowed. But it was wine, and the social functions that wine served in the Neolithic world as a prestige good, as a ritual substance, as a medicine, as a food that preserved some of the calories of a perishable fruit in a more durable form, were the recognizably the same functions that wine serves today. Beer preceded wine in most of the cereal farming cultures. In approximately 3500 BC in Mesopotamia, the first organized beer production is visible in the fermentation vessels in a storage room. Large clay fermentation vessels, the woman tending them lifting a cover to check the fermentation progress. The visible bubbling of active yeast fermentation on the grain mash. The discovery that grain left wet for long enough would ferment into a mildly intoxicating beverage was almost certainly an accidental observation that became a deliberate practice. The fermented grain drink is nutritious. The fermentation process converts some of the grain's complex carbohydrates into simpler sugars and produces B vitamins as a byproduct of yeast metabolism. It is safer than unfermented water in many contexts because the mild acidity and alcohol content inhibit the bacteria that make water unsafe to drink. And there is a spring ceremony at the field edge, the community gathered before planting begins, a community elder performing a ritual with offerings of grain on a flat stone altar. The integration of spiritual practice with agricultural practice. The agricultural calendar produced the ritual calendar. The moments in the agricultural cycle, planting, the first emergence of the seedlings, the harvest, and the storing of the grain for winter, became the moments of communal celebration and communal anxiety that required ritual management. Every major religion in human history has agricultural roots. The gods of the earliest civilizations are gods of rain, of fertility, of the harvest. The ritual year of every ancient society is organized around the agricultural year. The spiritual dimension of the agricultural revolution is not separate from the practical dimension. It is the community's way of managing the anxiety that the agricultural system's vulnerabilities produce and the gratitude that a good harvest inspires.
The agricultural community was not only a food production system, it was a social system. And the social system it produced was different in fundamental ways from the social system of the hunter-gatherer band. The hunter-gatherer band was mobile. Its social bonds were the bonds of a small group that spent all of its time together, moved together, ate together, and depended on each other for immediate survival. The group was dense in its social fabric, but small in its membership. The agricultural community was larger, denser in its physical settlement, and required new kinds of social bonds that could hold together a community of hundreds or thousands of people who did not all know each other personally. Those bonds were supplied by kinship networks, by shared ritual,
by common ancestry and by the physical landscape itself. The burial of the dead beneath the floors of the living. At Çatalhöyük in approximately 7500 BC, the dead are not buried outside the settlement in separate cemeteries. They are buried beneath the plastered floors of the houses in which they lived. The house floor is at once a living surface and a layer over the dead. The family who sleeps on a plastered floor at Çatalhöyük is sleeping above their ancestors. This is not morbid in the Neolithic context. It is intimate. The ancestors are physically present. The connection between the living and the dead is not metaphorical, but literal. The floor between them is only a few centimeters of lime plaster. The ancestor in the floor is also a social technology. The claim to a place, to a specific house, a specific field, a specific portion of the irrigation system is legitimated by the presence of ancestors. To be buried beneath a floor is to stake a claim to that floor, to say that this place belongs to this family, not because they built it first, but because their dead are here. This use of ancestry to legitimate land claims will persist for the entire history of human settlement. The connection between the dead and the land they are buried in, and the claim of the living who share that ancestry to the same land, is one of the oldest political arguments on Earth. The obsidian trade was connecting communities that did not share ancestry, producing social bonds of a different kind. A trader arriving at a Levantine farming settlement from Anatolia with a packload of black obsidian nodules wrapped in animal skins. The settlement inhabitants examining the sharp black obsidian with visible interest. The obsidian as a deep black lustrous material against the brown earth tones of the settlement. Obsidian is volcanic glass, a natural material that produces, when properly knapped, the sharpest edge achievable with stone tools. The volcanic sources of obsidian are geographically specific. Obsidian from the volcanic lakes of Anatolia is found in Neolithic settlements hundreds of kilometers from the source. This is trade, long-distance exchange of valued materials between communities. Long-distance trade requires trust. You cannot trade with strangers you will never see again on the same basis that you trade within a community where everyone knows everyone. The trader who arrives with obsidian and leaves with grain is a stranger. The relationship that allows this exchange to happen, the shared norms, the reputation system, the mutual recognition of trade value, is a social technology as important as any material technology. The textile trade follows the same logic. Linen production from cultivated flax, the retting of the flax stems in water troughs, the pulling apart of the wet stalks by hand, the preparation of the fiber for spinning, is visible as a domestic process in Neolithic settlements across the Fertile Crescent. But the finished cloth moves through trade networks. Cloth is portable, valuable, and durable. It is one of the earliest forms of traded wealth. The dam across a seasonal stream is being built by the whole community. 10 people working together placing stones across a stream channel, the reservoir beginning to fill behind the completed section. The organized labor of water management that binds the community into a coordinated technical enterprise. The dam will benefit everyone whose fields draw from the stream below it, but the dam must be built by everyone, maintained by everyone, and managed by everyone. The technical infrastructure of early agriculture required institutional infrastructure, rules about who controls the water and when, rules about who is responsible for maintenance, rules about what happens when the system breaks down. These rules are not laws in any formal sense yet. They're customs, shared understandings of how things work, enforced by community pressure and the practical necessity of maintaining the infrastructure on which everyone's food supply depends. The bone needle being carved from a small bone fragment communicates a different kind of community technology. The fine sewing needle for leather and linen work carved using a flint graver, the eye hole bored with a fine flint point. The skill required to produce a bone needle,
To shape a fragment of bone into a precisely sized, precisely pointed implement with a smooth, functional eye is not obvious. It requires specific knowledge and practiced hands. Craft knowledge in the Neolithic world was specialized knowledge. Not everyone could make a good bone needle. Not everyone could fire a clay pot to the right temperature. Not everyone could select seed grain with the discrimination that produces a better crop next year. The concentration of specific practical knowledge in specific individuals and the transmission of that knowledge through apprenticeship was the mechanism by which agricultural communities maintained their technological capability across generations.
The agricultural revolution was not a gift, it was a transaction. What human beings gave up in exchange for the security and the productive capacity of agriculture was in some ways more than what they received. The weeding. A Neolithic farmer in approximately 9000 BC in the Fertile Crescent, kneeling in the grain field, carefully pulling unwanted plants from between the cultivated grain stalks. The cultivated grain plants noticeably taller and more uniform than the weed plants being removed. Weeding is the shadow of cultivation. Wild plants grow wherever the conditions allow. A cultivated field with its turned soil and regular watering is an extraordinarily attractive environment for all plants, not just the ones you want. The agricultural farmer's perpetual challenge is maintaining the distinction between the wanted and the unwanted in a system that naturally tends toward the elimination of that distinction. The time spent weeding is time not spent doing other things. The weeding requirement is part of the agricultural bargain. You get the surplus, you pay for it with the labor of maintaining the system that produces it. And sometimes the system fails. 3 farmers examining a failed crop in a drought year in approximately 8000 BC. The grain plants visibly shorter and thinner than in a good year. The soil cracked and dry between the plants. One farmer kneeling to examine the roots of a dying plant. This is what agricultural vulnerability looks like. The hunter-gatherer community facing a resource shortage has options: move to where the resources are better, exploit different resource types, expand the geographic range of foraging. The farming community facing a crop failure has fewer options. The crop is where it is, the storage is what it is. If the harvest is inadequate, the community will go hungry. The agricultural revolution exchanged dietary diversity for productivity. Hunter-gatherer communities typically exploit dozens of different food species so that the failure of any one species does not threaten the whole food supply. Agricultural communities concentrate their food production in a few high-yield crops so that the failure of those crops is potentially catastrophic. The history of agricultural civilization is punctuated by famines. Not occasional famines that represent exceptional bad luck, but recurring famines that represent the systemic vulnerability of a food system organized around a small number of high-yield but climate-sensitive crops. The famines are written into the archaeological record as population declines, settlement abandonments, and the skeletal evidence of starvation in the people who lived through the bad years. The agricultural revolution did not eliminate hunger, it reorganized hunger. It produced more food on average, but it also produced periods of catastrophic food scarcity that hunter-gatherer populations were better buffered against. But the bad years were survived. The harvest feast that follows a good year was a genuine celebration, not a performance of gratitude, but the real expression of a community that has lived through the anxiety of growing its food and arrived at the result on the other side. The farming community gathered around a large central fire at the end of a harvest, large ceramic cooking vessels over the fire, people seated on the ground eating together, children running between the adults. This is not a ritual feast in the sense of a formal ceremony. It is the natural human response to the relief of having enough food for another year. Eating together. The specific warmth of a community sharing the product of collective agricultural labor. And the transmission of knowledge that keeps the community alive through the next cycle. An older Neolithic farmer teaching a young teenager to plant in approximately 8000 BC. The elder on his knees in the prepared soil, showing the teenager the correct depth and spacing for grain seeds. The teenager watching carefully.
the elder's hands demonstrating the planting motion in the dark soil. This moment, the experienced farmer showing the inexperienced one how to do it correctly, is the agricultural community's most important reproductive act, more important in some ways than the planting itself. The planting happens once a year. The knowledge of how to plant correctly has to be transmitted to every generation, or the community loses the ability to sustain itself. The knowledge that is being transmitted is not just technical, it is also relational. The elder teaching the teenager is showing him not just how to plant seed, but how to read the soil, how to know when the ground is ready, how to feel the depth of moisture in the turned earth, how to judge spacing by the width of a hand, how to recognize the signals that the growing season sends about what the crop needs. This knowledge cannot be written down in 8000 BC. It can only be learned by doing it alongside someone who has done it many times before. The apprenticeship is not just a teaching method, it is the information storage system of the agricultural community.
Göbekli Tepe is the most disorienting site in the archaeology of the agricultural revolution. It was built approximately 9500 BC in southeastern Turkey. The monumental structures visible on the hilltop, massive T-shaped limestone pillars arranged in circular enclosures, the pillars carved with extraordinary animal reliefs in high relief, required a level of labor organization that archaeologists associated with settled agricultural communities. But the people who built it were not yet fully agricultural. The animal bones at Göbekli Tepe are overwhelmingly from wild animals. There is no evidence of cultivated grain in the earliest layers. The people who organized the labor to quarry and erect stone pillars weighing tens of tons, and who carved those pillars with foxes and snakes and bulls and cranes in a style that communicates genuine artistic sophistication, appear to have been hunter-gatherers who had not yet fully made the transition to farming. This reversal of the assumed relationship, the idea that organized religion and monumental architecture require agriculture to precede them, has forced archaeologists to reconsider the entire sequence of the agricultural revolution. Perhaps agriculture did not produce the social complexity that produced the monuments. Perhaps the social complexity and the organizational demands of building and maintaining sacred sites like Göbekli Tepe produced the pressure toward the concentrated food supply that agriculture provides. The pillar carvings at close range are extraordinary. A carved fox in high relief on the limestone surface, a snake below it in lower relief. The specific artistic confidence of the carving, the knowledge of how to represent an animal's form in stone, the choice of composition, the judgment of depth of relief, communicates a visual tradition that was sophisticated long before Göbekli Tepe was built. The people who built this could draw, they could plan, they could organize large work crews, they could quarry and transport and erect massive stone structures with accuracy and intention. The absence of agriculture was not the absence of complexity. The agricultural mind that developed after Göbekli Tepe was practical in its deepest nature. It understood cause and effect in the specific form of what you do now, producing results in the future. And it was developing through accumulated observation an understanding of the soil that went beyond the immediate harvest. Two adjacent fields in a Neolithic farming settlement in approximately 7000 BC. One planted with grain showing good growth, the adjacent field left fallow, not abandoned, but deliberately rested. A Neolithic farmer examining the soil of the fallow field. Fallow is one of the first sophisticated agricultural management techniques. The recognition that land that has been cropped for several years in a row produces progressively worse yields, and that resting the land for a season or two allows it to recover, requires sustained observation across multiple seasons. It requires comparing the yield of rested land with continuously cropped land. It requires the willingness to sacrifice short-term production for long-term sustainable yield. This is not an obvious conclusion. A farmer who is hungry does not want to rest his field. The temptation is always to plant as much as possible.
The decision to fallow a field is a decision made against the immediate interest for the sake of the long-term interest. It requires a community that has enough experience and enough reserves to absorb the short-term cost. The soil amendment that follows naturally from the management of domestic animals, a farmer spreading animal dung across a field before planting in approximately 7000 BC. The specific knowledge that animal waste improves crop growth, a knowledge that develops from observing the natural fertility of areas where animals graze and rest, visible in the purposeful application. The logic of manuring is not obvious until it has been observed. The field that is manured grows better crops than the field that is not. The difference is visible within a single growing season. Once observed, the connection between animal waste and crop productivity is remembered and applied. The seed bank, the storage of reserve seed separate from food grain, is perhaps the agricultural community's most important insurance policy. The storage room with sealed clay vessels of different sizes, a farmer carefully opening one vessel and checking the stored seeds inside, removing a handful to examine for quality. The seed bank represents a kind of temporal thinking that is characteristic of agricultural communities, setting aside resources now against a future contingency that may or may not occur. The stored seed is not food today. It is food security in future years if the harvest fails. The decision to maintain seed reserves at the cost of immediate consumption is the agricultural equivalent of the hunter-gatherer's decision to share meat rather than consume it alone, a decision that makes the group more resilient at a small cost to the individual in the short term.
The date palms along the lower Euphrates River in approximately 5000 BC are one of the most important trees in the history of human civilization, and they are almost invisible in most accounts of the agricultural revolution. A date palm grove along an irrigation channel, the palms' silhouettes with their crown of fronds visible against the morning sky. Farmers harvesting clusters of ripe dates from ladders propped against the palm trunks. The date palm is extraordinarily productive. A single mature palm can produce up to 100 kilograms of fruit per year. The dates can be eaten fresh, dried for storage, or fermented into wine. The palm's heart can be eaten. The fronds can be used for thatch and basket making. The fiber from the trunk can be made into rope. In the Mesopotamian world, the date palm was not simply an agricultural crop. It was an entire economy. The accounting records of early Mesopotamian cities are full of dates, quantities of dates received, quantities distributed, quantities owed, quantities in storage. Dates were a currency in everything but name. The surplus distribution system that agricultural communities developed to manage this production was one of the first forms of political economy. A community elder at a central point measuring grain from a communal storage vessel into family portions using a standard clay measure, families waiting in an organized line, the measurement being watched carefully by those waiting. The first redistribution economy in its working state. The person who controls the measurement controls the distribution. The person who controls the distribution controls the power. This observation, which must have been made independently many times by many people in many early agricultural communities, is the beginning of political authority as we understand it. Authority in hunter-gatherer communities is personal. The experienced hunter, the skilled healer, the person who has demonstrated particular knowledge or capability. It is not institutional. It does not outlast the individual. Authority in agricultural communities is increasingly institutional. It derives from control of the storage, the irrigation system, the measurement of the surplus, the administration of the distribution. This authority can be transferred, inherited, contested, and accumulated in ways that personal authority cannot. The agricultural surplus created the first political economies, and political economies created the first states. In the craft workshop adjacent to the farming community, a potter visible working full-time at making ceramic vessels while his neighbor's field is visible through the open door. A pile of completed vessels for exchange.
the separation of craft from farming. The craft specialist who does not farm is one of the most important new social categories in the history of human organization. Before agriculture, everyone fed themselves. There was no surplus to support people who did not participate in food production. After agriculture, the surplus makes it possible to feed people who contribute to the community in ways other than food production. The potter feeds the farming community's need for ceramic vessels. The metalworker feeds the community's need for metal tools. The weaver feeds the community's need for cloth. Each specialist trades their product for the food grown by the farmers, and the farmers receive in exchange goods that improve their agricultural productivity or their quality of life. The agricultural population growth that naturally follows the agricultural success. The existing village with its established structures and surrounding fields. New house construction at the village edge as young adults build their own houses. The agricultural population growth made visible in the physical expansion of the settlement. The agricultural population grew because the agricultural food supply allowed it to grow. A typical hunter-gatherer woman had a birth interval of 4 years between children. The demands of a mobile lifestyle and the physical drain on lactation on an already energy-demanding lifestyle made shorter intervals difficult. A settled agricultural woman could have shorter intervals, 3 years or even 2, because her lifestyle was less physically demanding and her diet, while nutritionally narrower, was more calorically reliable. More children survived. More children grew to adulthood. The agricultural community that housed 100 people in 8000 BC housed 200 by 7500 BC. The agricultural surplus was converted into people. And more people required more food, which required more farming, which produced more surplus, which produced more people. The demographic engine of the agricultural revolution, once started, ran without stopping.
The agricultural community was richer than its hunter-gatherer neighbors. It had stored grain, it had livestock, it had permanent structures. It had the accumulated investment of years of labor in its fields and orchards and irrigation systems. These were things worth taking. The first land dispute between two Neolithic farming settlements in approximately 7000 BC. Men from two adjacent settlements at the shared edge of their agricultural territories, one group pointing at a boundary stone while others gestured toward a disputed field strip. The boundary stone is itself a new thing in the world. Hunter-gatherers do not have boundary stones. They have territories, understood ranges within which their group primarily forages, but these ranges overlap with adjacent groups. They are porous and negotiable, and the knowledge of where one group's territory ends and another's begins is carried in the heads of the people involved rather than marked in the landscape. The agricultural settlement requires marked boundaries. The field strip that has been cleared and plowed and planted belongs to someone. The question of whom it belongs to and who has the right to the water in the irrigation channel that runs beside it and who has priority access to the spring that feeds the channel can generate conflict of a kind that mobile foragers avoid by moving away from each other. The first permanent defensive structure in human history was not built by a warrior civilization. It was built by farmers. The pre-pottery Neolithic stone wall at Jericho in approximately 8000 BC, with its stone tower, is the physical expression of the agricultural community's vulnerability to the raiders who could take what the farmers had stored and grown. The investment in building a wall around the settlement represents a calculation. The value of what is inside the wall is worth the labor cost of building the wall. This calculation would have been impossible for a mobile community with few portable possessions. It is only possible for a settled community with stored grain and managed animals and permanent structures that cannot be quickly moved. The wall at Jericho is a monument to the agricultural bargain in its most direct form. You can have the surplus, you can have the permanence, you can have the population density, but you must have the wall. The diversity of crops within a Neolithic settlement was one of the community's most important risk management strategies. Fields of several different crops growing in adjacent plots,
einkorn wheat in one field, emmer wheat in another, lentils in a third. The polyculture agriculture of early farming. The logic of crop diversity is the same as the logic of the diversified hunter-gatherer diet. If one resource fails, others remain. A drought that damages the wheat may not damage the lentils as severely. A pest that attacks one variety of grain may not attack another. Growing multiple crops is a form of insurance. The terracing of hillside land for agriculture in approximately 7000 BC in the Levant. Farmers cutting into a hill slope to create the first agricultural terraces, building low retaining walls from the cut stone. The lower completed terraces already planted with grain. The terrace represents a significant investment in a place. The labor required to cut terraces into a hill slope and build their retaining walls is substantial. Terraces are not something you build if you might move next year. They are something you build when you intend to farm this hillside indefinitely, when you are committing not just yourself, but your children and their children to the agricultural development of a specific piece of landscape. The terrace, like the olive tree and the grapevine, is a form of rootedness that goes beyond the individual's lifetime. It is the creation of infrastructure that future generations will inherit, maintain, and depend on. It is agriculture becoming civilization, the investment in the long term at the cost of the short term, the creation of a world for people who are not yet born, and the first wool harvest in approximately 4000 BC. A Neolithic herder carefully removing fleece from a sheep using a sharp flint scraper. The thick, cream-colored wool fleece being peeled from the sheep's back in a single piece. The domesticated sheep that produces a usable wool fleece is not the same animal as the wild mouflon from which it was bred. Wild sheep do not have a fleece that is useful for textile production. They have a coarse outer coat and a soft undercoat that sheds annually in spring. The selective breeding that produced domestic sheep with a continuous, dense fleece suitable for spinning and weaving took thousands of years. The wool harvest, like the milk, is a renewable resource. You can shear the sheep every year without killing it. The ongoing productivity of the managed animal, as opposed to the one-time productivity of the hunted animal, is one of the primary arguments for domestication. The sheep that you shear every spring is worth more than the mouflon you kill once.
The management of wild bee colonies is one of the more charming details of early agricultural practice. A beekeeper in approximately 5000 BC in the Near East, removing a section of honeycomb from a clay cylinder hive placed against a settlement wall. Smoke from a small smoldering fire keeping the bees calm. The golden honeycomb with its hexagonal cells full of honey. Honey was the only concentrated sweetener available before the agricultural revolution made sugarcane cultivation possible. And even after that, it remained the most accessible sweetener for most agricultural communities. The managed bee colony provided honey, beeswax for waterproofing and candle making, and probably served ritual and medicinal functions that we know less about. The clay cylinder hive placed against a settlement wall is a simple technology. It provides the bees with a dark enclosed space for comb construction. It allows the beekeeper to access the combs without dismantling the colony entirely. It represents the translation of the wild bee colony, which exists in tree hollows and rock crevices, into a managed agricultural resource. The demonstration of the new copper sickle's effectiveness in a grain field in approximately 4500 BC is a moment of engineering elegance. Two farmers working side by side, one with a flint sickle, one with a copper sickle. The copper blade cutting visibly faster and more cleanly through the grain stalks. The copper sickle is not simply a better flint sickle, it is a different kind of tool, produced by a fundamentally different technology, requiring different raw materials from different sources, shaped by a different manufacturing process. The metalworker who makes the copper sickle is a specialist who has no equivalent in a purely stone tool technology. The trade network that brings copper to settlements that lack local copper sources is a network with no equivalent in a hunter-gatherer economy. The adoption of metal tools in agricultural societies was not uniform or rapid. Stone tools continued to be used alongside metal tools for centuries after the introduction of the first metal objects. The cost and scarcity of metal meant that metal tools were initially prestige objects as much as practical ones. A farmer with a copper sickle in 4500 BC was not just a more efficient farmer, he was also a person of sufficient status or wealth to have acquired a metal tool. The domestication of the donkey in approximately 5000 BC in northeast Africa is the agricultural revolution's answer to the transportation problem. A Neolithic African farmer loading 2 large clay storage jars onto a domesticated donkey's back using woven fiber panniers, the donkey standing patiently. The donkey is not glamorous. It lacks the power of the ox, the speed of the horse, the versatility of the camel. But it is extraordinarily well adapted to the specific transportation needs of early agriculture. It is small enough to navigate the narrow paths between fields and the lanes of villages. It is hardy and requires relatively little water. It can carry significant loads over long distances on rough terrain. It is docile enough to be managed by a single person without specialized handling skills. The domestication of the donkey transformed the agricultural community's ability to move goods. Before the donkey, the movement of grain and storage vessels and agricultural products was entirely dependent on human labor, primarily through carrying loads on the back or on the head. The donkey multiplied the transportation capacity of the agricultural community by a factor of several times over. The cultivation of lentils in approximately 8000 BC is one of the unsung heroes of the agricultural revolution. A Neolithic farmer tending a field of lentils, examining the developing seed pods. Legumes, lentils, peas, chickpeas, and beans were domesticated at approximately the same time as the cereal grains, and they were domesticated for a reason that early Neolithic farmers probably did not consciously understand but empirically observed. Legumes fix atmospheric nitrogen in their root nodules, enriching the soil in which they grow with a nutrient that cereal grains deplete. A field rotated between grain and legumes is more productive over time than a field continuously cropped with grain. The first shaduf water-lifting device in approximately 3500 BC in Mesopotamia is a moment of engineering elegance. A wooden pole and counterweight device to lift water from an irrigation channel to a field above it. The bucket descending to the water level and the counterweight rising. The device mounted on its forked post in its working mechanical detail. The shaduf solves the problem of raising water above the level of the river or canal that contains it. Without a lifting mechanism, the only land that can be irrigated is land that is at or below the water source. With the shaduf, land that is above the water source, land that catches more sunlight, drains better, is less vulnerable to flooding, becomes irrigable. The principle is simple. A counterweight on one end of a long lever, a bucket on the other. The counterweight is sized to approximately equal the weight of the full bucket, so that the mechanical effort required to raise the loaded bucket is only slightly more than the effort required to pull the empty counterweight down. The energy savings compared to lifting a bucket by brute strength alone are significant over the course of a day of irrigation work.
The agricultural revolution transformed not just human societies, but human bodies. This is not a metaphor. The physical form of the human body changed as a result of the agricultural transition in ways that are legible in the archaeological record. The harvest celebration that closes the agricultural year is a genuine human moment. The farming community gathered around a large fire between the village structures, people sharing food from clay vessels, a drummer beating a clay drum, some people dancing, children sleeping on the periphery. But the comparison between the people celebrating this harvest and their hunter-gatherer ancestors from 1,000 years before would have shown physical differences. The agricultural farmers were, on average, shorter. Their skeletons showed more evidence of nutritional stress, the lines in bone formation that occurred during periods of inadequate nutrition. Their teeth showed more decay, Their bones showed more pathology from the repetitive physical stress of agricultural labor, the grinding of grain, the harvesting of crops, the carrying of loads. The agricultural diet, based heavily on grain, was nutritionally adequate in terms of calories, but narrower than the varied diet of hunter-gatherers who ate many different plant and animal species. The specific nutrients that come from dietary diversity, particular vitamins and minerals, different protein sources, variety of fatty acids, were less available in the grain-dominated diet of early farmers. The agricultural revolution fed more people. It did not, on average, feed them better. The close comparison between wild and domesticated grain in approximately 8000 BC, a Neolithic farmer holding two grain stalks side by side, the wild einkorn on the left with its small, fragile seed head that shatters easily to disperse seeds, the cultivated einkorn on the right, visibly taller with a larger, denser seed head that stays intact for harvesting. This is the agricultural revolution in its genetic form. The difference between the two stalks is the difference between a plant that evolved to disperse its seeds into the wild and a plant that has been unconsciously selected over hundreds of generations of human cultivation to retain its seeds for human harvesting. The domestic relationship between the human cultivator and the cultivated plant is one of mutual dependence. The farmer needs the grain. The grain, in its domesticated form, needs the farmer. The agricultural revolution created a biological dependency as well as a social one. The growth of settlements towards proto-urban scale is the social expression of this dependency. Tel Brak, in northeastern Syria in approximately 4000 BC, a large mounded settlement visible rising above the surrounding agricultural plain. Its scale communicating that the agricultural surplus is now supporting a population too large to be called a village. Tel Brak shows something new in the archaeological record of human settlement, the evidence of genuine urban-scale administration. Eye-shaped clay objects by the thousands, probably tokens used in accounting. Large administrative buildings, the physical infrastructure of managing a population so large that formal community management has been replaced by formal institutional management. The city was not planned, it grew. Agricultural surplus accumulated in storage. Storage attracted more people because the reliable food supply could support more people than the surrounding agricultural land could support if those people were farming it themselves. Craft specialists, administrators, merchants, priests, people who contributed to the city's functions without directly growing food, gathered around the stored surplus. The surplus fed the city managed the surplus. The cycle produced more surplus, which produced more city. The marsh settlement of early Mesopotamia shows the flexibility of agricultural adaptation. Reed houses settled on slightly elevated ground between the marshes, farmers harvesting wild marsh resources alongside their cultivated plots. The southern Mesopotamian marsh farmers were solving the problem of cultivating one of the most difficult agricultural environments in the Near East, land that was too flat to drain naturally, too prone to flooding, and too saline from centuries of irrigation to support reliable crops. By combining the management of wild wetland resources with small-scale cultivation on the elevated ground between the marshes. Their reed houses, built on artificial platforms and using the reed marsh as the primary building material, represent one of the most environmentally adapted architectural traditions in the ancient world. And their descendants still live in the same marshes, building the same kinds of reed houses in the 21st century.
The agricultural revolution moved from its origin points in the Fertile Crescent, in China, in New Guinea, in Mesoamerica. The agricultural traditions spread, sometimes by the movement of peoples, sometimes by the transmission of ideas and seed stocks and animal breeds through trade networks, sometimes by both processes simultaneously. The spread of agriculture from the Fertile Crescent to Europe was one of the most consequential migrations in human history. A pioneering Neolithic farming family in the European Danube Valley in approximately 6000 BC. The family visible with their domesticated animals and their seed grain in baskets.
the rich Danube Valley landscape visible around them with its uncleared forest. The Danube Valley was not uninhabited. Mesolithic hunter-gatherers had been living in European forests for thousands of years before the Neolithic farmers arrived. The encounter between the two groups, the settled farmers from the southeast with their grain and their animals and their permanent buildings, and the mobile foragers with their deep knowledge of the European forest environment, was complex and varied. In some areas, the contact appears to have been largely peaceful, with the two groups coexisting and gradually exchanging knowledge and practices. In other areas, the genetic evidence suggests that the farmers replaced the foragers more completely and more rapidly. The reasons for the variation are not entirely understood. What is clear is that within a few thousand years of the initial agricultural arrivals in Europe, the agricultural tradition had spread across most of the continent, transforming forests into fields and nomadic camps into permanent villages. The linear pottery culture of Central Europe, in approximately 5500 BC, built the characteristic longhouse, a very long timber structure, sometimes 30 or 40 meters in length, with a distinctive trapezoidal cross-section and thatched roof. The settlement of a linear pottery culture village, with its several longhouses arranged in a loose cluster, cultivated fields cleared from the surrounding forest, and domesticated cattle grazing near the buildings, is visually distinctive from the mud brick villages of the Near East, but functionally similar. Different building materials, the same agricultural logic. The arrival of farming in Britain in approximately 4000 BC shows the agricultural revolution reaching one of its most geographically remote destinations. Neolithic farmers visible clearing chalk downland in southern England for the first British cultivated fields. Oak woodland being felled with polished stone axes. The chalk grassland appearing from beneath the cleared woodland. Domesticated cattle on the cleared ground. The British Neolithic is one of the most intensely studied periods in prehistoric archaeology, partly because it left extraordinary physical traces in the landscape. The long barrows, the stone circles, the causewayed enclosures, the cursus monuments, that have survived for 4,000 years in a way that the mud brick settlements of the Near East generally have not. The Neolithic monument building in Britain in approximately 3500 BC is the clearest expression of the agricultural surplus being invested in collective, non-productive enterprise. A large community hauling an enormous sarsen stone on wooden rollers toward a monument construction site on a chalk plain. The sarsen stones at Stonehenge weigh up to 25 tons. Moving them from their source on the Marlborough Downs, 40 kilometers from Stonehenge, without wheeled vehicles or domesticated horses, was a logistical achievement that required organized collective labor on a scale that only a well-fed, well-organized agricultural community could supply. The monument is not productive in any agricultural sense. It does not grow food. It does not improve the land. It does not provide shelter or storage. What it provides is meaning. It marks place. It commemorates ancestors. It expresses the community's understanding of its relationship with the cosmos. The agricultural surplus made this possible. The monument, in a very direct sense, is made of grain. And on the Eurasian steppe, a new chapter in the agricultural adjacent story of domestication was beginning. Early horse domestication in approximately 3500 BC in the Botai culture area of modern Kazakhstan. A group of Botai culture people interacting with a small herd of semi-tame horses on the open steppe. One man holding a halter rope attached to a horse that is accepting its constraint. The horse domestication happened much later than the domestication of sheep, goats, and cattle, and it happened in a very different environment, the open steppe of Central Asia, rather than the hilly flanks of the Fertile Crescent. And it had consequences far beyond agriculture. The domesticated horse, once combined with wheeled vehicles and then with the stirrup and the saddle, transformed human mobility and military organization in ways that the agricultural revolution itself had not anticipated.
The skeletal evidence from early agricultural communities is a record of the physical cost of the transition. An archaeologist's brush gently cleaning a Neolithic skull in an excavation.
The skull showing the characteristic dental decay patterns that grain-based diets produced compared to the healthier teeth of hunter-gatherers. Dental caries, tooth decay, is rare in hunter-gatherer skeletal populations and common in early agricultural populations. The reason is simple. Fermentable carbohydrates in the diet, starches and sugars, feed the bacteria in the mouth that produce the acid that causes tooth decay. A heavily based diet on cooked grain is a diet high in fermentable carbohydrates. The skeletal evidence of nutritional stress in early farming communities, the growth arrest lines in bone, the porosity of skull bone that indicates anemia, the evidence of infectious diseases that spread more readily in dense, settled populations, is part of the archaeological record that complicates any simple narrative of the agricultural revolution as human progress. Progress towards what? Towards more people, certainly. Towards larger, more complex societies, certainly. Towards the cities and the writing and the monuments and the art and all the other things we identify with civilization. But not, it seems, towards the health and the dietary richness that the hunter-gatherer ancestors of the first farmers enjoyed. The copper sickle demonstration is the technological promise. The skull is the cost. Both are part of the same story. The comparison between stone and copper sickles in a grain field in approximately 4500 BC, two farmers working side by side, the copper blade cutting visibly faster and cleaner. The improvement is real and significant. More grain can be harvested in the critical window before the seeds fall. The harvest loss is reduced. The labor cost of the harvest is reduced per unit of grain produced. The agricultural productivity of the community increases. The increase in agricultural productivity is converted into more people. More people means more demand for food. More demand for food means more intensification of agricultural production. More intensification means more pressure on the land, more dependence on the grain crop, more vulnerability to crop failure. The agricultural revolution was a treadmill as much as a liberation. The productivity improvements that increased the food supply were systematically converted into population growth, which then required further productivity improvements. The surplus was never quite large enough for long. There was always pressure for more. The cuneiform tablet being written by a Sumerian scribe in approximately 3200 BC, a scribe pressing wedge marks into wet clay with a reed stylus. The tablet showing the rows of marks as an agricultural accounting record. Clay tablets of previous records stacked on a shelf behind. Writing was invented to count grain. The first records in cuneiform are not poetry or history or theological texts. They are receipts. Quantities of barley received, quantities of oil dispersed, numbers of sheep owed, the accounting of an agricultural economy that had grown too complex to be tracked by human memory alone. The agricultural surplus created the information management problem. Writing was the solution. And once the technology of writing existed, once it was possible to make durable records of information, its applications proliferated beyond accounting. The laws, the histories, the poetry, the theological texts, the scientific observations, the philosophical arguments of every civilization that followed, all of it was made possible by the writing technology that the agricultural surplus made necessary. The large organized grain harvest in approximately 4000 BC in Mesopotamia, 20 workers in the field cutting grain with bronze and copper sickles in organized rows, the organized division of labor of a large-scale agricultural operation. This is the agricultural revolution at scale, not the tentative first planting of 9500 BC, not the experimental field of 9000 BC, a large, organized, socially complex enterprise producing surplus on a scale that will support cities. 20 workers in a field is not a family. It is a community organized for production. Someone decided how many workers to allocate to this field on this day. Someone organized the division of the workers into cutters and gatherers and carriers. Someone will receive the harvest and account for it and distribute it or store it according to a plan. The agricultural enterprise has become social infrastructure. And the city granary at Uruk in approximately 3500 BC is where it all arrives. A large storage building complex with thick mud brick walls and multiple sealed storage chambers. Workers unloading grain from carts and passing it through the storage entrance.
administrative officials with clay tablets recording the incoming quantities, the agricultural surplus at the scale of civilization. The grain in the jars is the same grain that was pressed into the same soil 10,000 years ago. The gesture is the same. The scale is the civilizational product of everything that happened between.
The Neolithic long barrow is a monument to the agricultural revolution's deepest consequence. A Neolithic community constructing a long barrow in the British Isles in approximately 3800 BC. The community building the large earthen mound that will house the community's ancestors. Workers carrying wicker baskets of chalk rubble to build up the mound. The wooden chambered structure of the tomb visible inside the growing mound before it is covered. The long barrow is not primarily a grave. It is a territorial marker. It says, "Our ancestors are here. We belong here. This land is ours because our dead are in it." The agricultural revolution changed the relationship between human beings and death. Hunter-gatherers who were mobile could not maintain permanent memorials to their dead in specific places. They buried their dead where they happened to be, or carried them to regular burial grounds, or practiced mortuary rites that left no permanent physical trace. The bond between the living and the specific landscape was real, but not physically anchored. The farming community, by contrast, was deeply anchored. The fields had been cleared by the grandfather. The irrigation channel had been dug by the great-grandmother. The ancestors were not only buried in the ground, they had shaped the ground. The agricultural landscape was a collaboration between the living and the dead that stretched back through generations of labor. The monument to the ancestors was a way of making this invisible collaboration visible, of saying, "We did not make this world alone, they helped." And on a winter evening in a Neolithic farming settlement in approximately 7000 BC, a family gathered around a central hearth fire in the warm interior of a mud brick house. One person repairing a tool, one spinning fiber, children asleep on animal skin beds, the grain stores in sealed jars against the wall. The warmth and security of a settled agricultural winter. This is what the agricultural revolution ultimately produced. Not the monument and not the city, though it produced both. A room, a fire, enough food to last through the winter. The specific domestic security of people who know where they will be sleeping next week, next month, next year. The hunter-gatherer did not have this certainty. The hunting band that moved with the seasons lived in a world that provided richly but unpredictably. And the unpredictability required a certain kind of adaptive flexibility that was genuinely demanding. The ability to sleep in the same bed for decades, in the same house, in the same village, with the same people, with a jar of grain on the wall that will still be there in March. This was the agricultural revolution's most intimate gift. At dawn in the northern Fertile Crescent in approximately 7000 BC, the cultivated fields in the valley below a hillside settlement are catching the first light. Morning mist lies in the valley between the fields, the river moisture settling overnight into the valley air. The crop fields show their vivid green against the brown of the surrounding uncultivated land. The world's first agricultural landscape at the most beautiful moment of its morning. Every cultivated field in the world today is descended from this. Every rice paddy and every wheat field and every orchard and every vegetable garden in every greenhouse, in every rooftop farm, in every city on every continent is the direct descendant of those small, careful cleared plots on the hillsides of the Fertile Crescent. The seed that was pressed into the ground in 9500 BC is still being pressed into the ground. The gesture is unchanged. The scale is the difference between a world of 5 million hunter-gatherers and a world of 8 billion people. 8 billion people fed by agriculture, by the accumulated agricultural knowledge of 10,000 years, transmitted from farmer to farmer across hundreds of generations, refined and expanded and intensified and mechanized and globalized
and now facing challenges that the person who pressed the first seed into the earth could not have imagined. A Neolithic farming family returning home at the end of a harvest day. The family of 4 visible as silhouettes against the golden evening sky, walking along a path between their harvested fields towards their settlement. The parents carrying the last harvest bundles, the children walking alongside. The harvested field stubble on both sides of the path catching the horizontal evening light. This image is so old and so familiar that it is invisible. A family coming home from work, the children tired, the parents satisfied, the harvest done for another year, the food secured for another winter. There is nothing extraordinary about this moment. It has happened somewhere on Earth every day for 10,000 years. And in the last light of the evening over the Fertile Crescent where it all began, the sky holds its deepest afterglow. The Tigris River visible as a dark ribbon catching the last rose light. The cultivated fields on the valley sides in silhouette. A single farming settlement visible as a cluster of dark shapes with one cooking fire glowing orange. This is where human beings decided to stay. Not a decision made once by one person at one moment. 1,000 small decisions made by thousands of people over thousands of years, each one choosing the field over the road, the permanent house over the seasonal camp, the managed crop over the wild harvest. Each choice accumulating into the world. The fire in the settlement is the same fire that burned at the center of the hunter-gatherer camp. The people around it are the same species that carried spears through the oak woodland and gathered berries from the undergrowth. But they have built something that the campfire people could not have built, and they have lost something that the campfire people possessed. They have built the world. They have lost the road. 10,000 years ago, a person pressed a seed into the ground. Tonight, 8 billion people are fed by what grew from that gesture. Let that thought carry you to sleep.